Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, I have a pleasure to be joined by Kevin, and we're going to discuss all things CSS today. As you can probably imagine, if you've followed Kevin at all, which if you're listening to my channel, I'm guessing you've probably heard of Kevin's. But first place I'd like to start here, Kevin, is what is maybe a bit of your story? I know I've watched several of your videos, but I haven't really got much of a background on like how you got into this whole tech thing and what kind of led you to being, one of the leaders of the CSS community. I think so anyways. So yeah, what's a bit of your story and how'd you kind of get into CSS?
Yeah, it's been a bit, it's a bit of a strange story, I guess, in a way. I never planned for this to happen. It was really like I started mucking around with websites when I was in high school in the late 90s, just doing stuff for fun online, and I'd get a Photoshop opened and slice up something to like put a website together for some hobby project or something. And it basically stayed a hobby for a long time. Like I wouldn't touch it for a few years, and then I'd come back to it because it'd be like, oh, I could make a website for something like that. That would be fun. And that happened for a long time. I ended up going to school for film. I switched, got a BA in urban planning. So I was sort of all over the place. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And actually, once I graduated from urban planning, I basically needed a master's to get a job, and I didn't feel like doing that. And so I found an 18-month program in graphic design at like a vocational school not too far from where I lived. So I decided to do that because of that whole idea of Photoshop and being something I always played around with and had fun with. And then while I was there, I sort of fell back in love with the web. That's sort of like when CSS3 was becoming a thing, or just coming out. And so I started dabbling a lot more in that. But I stayed in the world of graphic design, eventually got a job doing that. And it was a really good job. I got to do a lot of stuff, but the pay wasn't the best. So I started freelancing. And when I was freelancing, I was doing work where I was doing a lot of the freelance work was like UI design stuff. And I'm like, well, if they're going to pay me to do the design of a website, I might as well see if they'll also pay me to make a website. Let's turn it in and get a little bit more money from it. And that's when I started realizing that I actually liked that side of things a lot more than actually designing stuff. And the main thing I was doing was creating child themes for WordPress. And it was sort of the easiest way to get something done, especially because, I had young kids at home. I was working full time during the day and then doing that like odd jobs at night. And the main thing I would do is I was using the Genesis theme, and then I would just delete their CSS file basically and make it look the way I wanted with my own CSS. And that's sort of what I guess really started it, where it was just like constantly it was almost like a CSS Zen Garden style thing where it's always roughly the same markup, and then you're just completely making different sites with it. And I really enjoyed that, like the puzzle of trying to like make things work. I really liked it a lot. And then I eventually got into teaching back at the original school that I'd gone to. They were looking for new teachers, and that was nothing I'd ever planned on doing. But as I mentioned, my full-time job wasn't paying great. So I was like, oh, I could try that, see how it goes. And when they found out I had some experience with web, I got the intro. Me and one other new teacher basically were teaching the intro to web classes over and over again, which was great. And it also made me realize I didn't really know what I was doing, because when you're hacking together websites, it's very different from explaining how to do it. And that's sort of what started me down the path of teaching people how to do stuff that I was doing.
Awesome. And then that kind of spiraled into your YouTube channel, and then here you are today. And it sounds like you had a bit of a maybe non-traditional path into kind of the development space. And I come from a similar background to where I actually did go get a master's degree, but it's something completely different, actually exercise science. And then once I finished that, I was like, I just got a master's degree. It's something that I could have done for free as like a personal trainer. I wouldn't even needed a degree. So that wasn't the best move by a young college kid, but then transitioned into kind of JavaScript in the development space as well. So very cool background there. And to kind of transition things a little bit into more kind of CSS related here. So are there any particular kind of CSS features that you think people maybe don't really know about or commonly overlook that you find super useful? And I know that you have a video going over several in depth, but maybe just high level, a few features that you think are kind of commonly overlooked that you actually find quite useful.
Yeah, so I think a lot of them are sort of these more niche things, so people don't really find out about them, but they're really useful for very specific things. One other one that I don't mention, I mean, I talk a lot about it on my channel, but I don't mention as an overlooked thing, would actually be grid, mostly from older developers who learned Flexbox really well when it was the only thing we had. And you sort of learn that that's the only thing, if it's the only one you have and you're able to make layouts with it, they're like, oh, it does the job, I'm going to stick with that. And I see a lot of sort of convoluted, or not, it's not always convoluted, it's just more complex solutions than what you need that you could do with grid instead. You definitely get, I think, newer people that are entering now that have both sometimes learn grid first, and then they do the opposite where they're like, oh, well, I can just use grid for layout. Why should I use Flexbox? And I do think it's sort of like, why do we have different types of shoes? You have your cleats for playing soccer and you're not going to wear those to go dancing or something. It's a little bit like that with Flexbox and grid. They're both two different layout tools, but they sort of have their they specialize in different things. So using the right one for the right job definitely does a good job, or makes your life easier. Some other ones though, on like that more minute scale, I guess. One of my favorite ones, I get why it's not commonly used, but it's the columns feature, which it's a little bit weird in how it works because you don't really get to decide where things break. You need to have heights on things. So like it is a little bit niche in how it would work, but I think a lot of people don't even know it exists. And basically just lets, like, say you have a div with text in it, you say columns 3 and then you get 3 columns. But it's even super responsive. So you could just say like columns, put 300 pixels. And it's going to make 300 pixel columns, but it doesn't actually lock into 300. It just treats 300 as the ideal size. So if there's room, like they won't be locked in it. It's almost like using Flexbox in a way where they'll grow and shrink according to whatever space is available. And if there's enough room for 6, there'll be 6. If there's enough room for 2, there'll be 2. You can set a maximum. So if you did columns 300 pixels, then like it maxes it out at 3. And anyway, they're super fun to play with. Definitely more niche though. The other one's a lot of the pseudo classes that we have, like empty, target, only child, or only of type. I think sometimes people use JavaScript for a lot of things where it's like, like, oh, I won't show this DOM node if it's empty because no content gets generated into it or something like that. But you could just do like empty pseudo class, like :empty, and then display none, and nothing that's empty will show up. There's only child, so you can style something different if it's the only child of something, or only of type. So if it's the only paragraph within a parent, you can style it differently. But if you have 4 paragraphs, then it sort of falls back to the original styling or something. There's a lot of I think pseudo classes, there's lots out there that people aren't aware of and we know focus, we know hover, but after that people tend to, that's about it. Or I guess nth of type is kind of popular too.
And I would say I'm definitely guilty of that as well. I definitely am more of like a JavaScript first developer, I would say, and then CSS is kind of like, a necessary evil almost, or at least it was in the past. When I first learned JavaScript, it's like, all right, now I got to do CSS. But I think the more I learn about it, the more I'm like, wow, there's a lot of cool things that you could do at CSS that actually saves you a lot of like JavaScript heartache, to where rather than writing all this, logic to, okay, every other div, I want to have this background color when I'm mapping over this list in React. Well, I can actually just do this using the odd pseudo selector in CSS and do things much easier. So I think just if someone like just reviewed the pseudo selectors of what's available to them and then looked up, like just knowing what's out there of what's available could save them a lot of JavaScript heartache. And maybe kind of stepping backwards to kind of the whole grid versus Flexbox discussion. Do you have any rules of thumb on when to use grid and when to use Flexbox? Because like you said, there's often times where you can kind of use either or, and there's maybe some janky things that you can do in Flexbox to kind of mimic the grid. So when do you kind of use grid and when do you kind of use Flexbox?
Yeah, I think the traditional sort of frame that you'd hear is Flexbox is good for 2D or 1D layouts and grid is good for 2D layouts. I'm not a big fan of that. It's more about the control you have. So Flexbox is more 1D control, whereas grid is 2D control. So the way I like to think about it more is that if you want the children to have influence on the layout, use Flexbox. And if you want the parent to have the control on the layout, then use Grid. There's ways of making Flexbox work more like the Grid way, and you can get Grid to, you can set your column sizes to actually have the children influence things. But that's where I feel like you're like fighting against the natural behavior of them. And again, there's always exceptions to this. This is like one of those like 90% rules. But like if you're using Grid, you're on the parent, you're saying, I want this many columns. Maybe you're saying how many rows, you're saying how big you want your columns, and then the content just fits into the cells that are being created. So it's really like the parent is in control of what's happening and the children are just falling into place. Whereas if you're using Flexbox, the children have so much influence on how the layout's being generated, especially by default, like the way Flexbox just works, where you do display flex and it's great for like a navigation, because if you use Grid for a navigation, then you'd have this, like every word in your navigation tends to be a different size, or even like if you're doing tags on a card or like a product or something that has tags on it, every word is a different size. So with Grid, each cell is going to want to be whatever you set it at. So they're all equal sized cells that this content is fitting in. So then you get this weird spacing thing if you have a long word and a short word. Whereas with Flexbox, every one is just the size it needs to be. So yeah, it's hard to go much more into detail without visuals to accompany it, but just that's my general rule, is like something simple, intrinsic sizing, where like the items figure it out themselves, Flexbox. If I want a structured layout, then I use Grid.
And I really like that kind of way of thinking about it. That's definitely kind of a different mental model that's usually taught out there. Usually, like you said, it's taught single dimension, use Flexbox, multi-dimensional, use Grid. And I think it can be a little bit complex thinking about like multi-dimensional, like what does that even kind of mean, and like what it's kind of harder to think about. But when you reason about it in which, okay, use Grid when you want your parent container to kind of control your layout, and use Flexbox when you want those child elements to have more control, I think that's a really kind of good way to think about things. So yeah, that's a very nice kind of mental model there. And then transitioning into the next topic here. So you had a video on CSS frameworks and are they taking over or not? And you kind of went over like the state of CSS and other kind of cool things in that video as well. So one question I have for you is like, what are your maybe just overall feelings on CSS frameworks? Like, I know Tailwind CSS has particularly got fairly popular, and before that we had Bootstrap and these other kind of frameworks to do CSS. How do you kind of feel about those compared to just using more like vanilla CSS?
Yeah, so I'm definitely more of the vanilla CSS guy. It's sort of everything I teach on my channel. So I think that for me, I fall into the camp of that's how I like writing it. And but I also understand why these other things exist, and I understand why people like them. I think the most important thing, if you are going to be using other tools, is to at least be pretty proficient at writing it without any of them. Not to say that you can't learn from those tools as well. Like I learned a lot about CSS using Bootstrap 3, I think it was back in the day. But it wasn't because I was using it. It's because I was looking at like, how does it actually work? At first I was just using it, but then I got curious and I'm like, why are they organizing their classes like this? I tried to break it down as much as possible. And I haven't used Bootstrap in years, but I took a lot of lessons away from it, and it did definitely influence how I write my own CSS. Tailwind's obviously very different in that it's, unless you're using like Tailwind UI, like Tailwind itself doesn't really come with that pre-built stuff that you get if you're using something like Foundation or Bootstrap. But again, I understand why people really like it, where it does take a certain level of abstraction away, or it adds a level of abstraction, I should say, that can make life a little bit easier for like certain consistencies and other things. I think it's a fantastic tool for like, if I want an MVP and just build it out really fast, you just throw it together and it comes, it's great for things like that. I think that it can lead to some bad habits. And I think the other problem is the main problem I see, because I do work with a lot of people that are beginners, and it's the same mistakes people are making, whether they're writing vanilla CSS or they're using Tailwind, since Tailwind's a sort of a different way to author CSS. And they're just making foundational mistakes, and like they have conflicting styles going on, and they have other stuff. For me, it's always a nightmare because debugging it, I'm looking at their class list and they have like 73 classes on something, because they're just layering solution on top of another solution that's not working. Like they don't delete a few stuff then to keep going. So it becomes a little bit, I'm just using my dev tools to try and figure things out. But yeah, again, I get why they're really popular. And it seems like, talking about that video that I did and the state of CSS, it does seem that Tailwind sort of found the people who really like it and the people who are using it regularly. And it seems to be, it's found its place sort of, I think. And it sort of seemed, I was really surprised actually. I was expecting it to still be really growing and have a bigger market share than at least what those results hinted at, which I found interesting. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it definitely did. And those results surprised me as well watching your video, as I feel like almost every tutorial I see, like create this course in, React or Next.js, it's always got a little Tailwind icon with it too. So it's like made me feel like, Tailwind is like the thing to learn. And I come like for my professional job for the last 3 or 4 years, we've just used vanilla CSS, but I've started learning Tailwind. And I think that if you come from like knowing CSS and knowing some best practices and knowing how to structure that well, Tailwind can provide some like nice kind of out of the box classes and help you develop a little bit quicker. And you don't have to worry about maybe necessarily managing a CSS file, which for me, I've kind of liked that about Tailwind, but I'm also pretty new to it. So I maybe haven't run into some of the debugging the 700 different classes and stuff like that, like maybe you have. But yeah, I think that's a definitely fair kind of criticism of it. And to me, it sounds like the maybe biggest thing that might be a downside of it is maybe people not learning just best practices in CSS, and then they're just running into issues with Tailwind. And then it's like, if they don't know how CSS kind of works and you try to unpack Tailwind, it just leads you down this kind of negative route. Does that sound fair?
100%. Yeah. And yeah, you get, it's just, if you don't like the thing I see used so often is like just putting 100 viewport width on things all the time in Tailwind. And I'm just like, you don't need like that. Or even like sometimes it's percent or sometimes it's viewport width. And I'm just like, let's, it's all these like useless declarations basically that sort of come up sometimes in there, just because they're not familiar. So they're like, I need this to be full width, so I'm putting full width on it. They needed this, I'm putting that. It's the same thing you see in regular vanilla CSS too. Like it's the same mistakes beginners make either way, but it just, so like maybe it's just because it's my audience, but definitely like the way I see the problems I see with it are often sort of revolve around just like, oh, I'm going to use Tailwind because it's easier. Or like everyone's saying like, oh, let's, it's sort of presented as this easier solution, but I don't think it is. I think it's something that can help you if you know CSS and it lets you work faster potentially. But I don't think it's necessary. And it does. I think one of the problems it also solves, that any framework I guess solves, is that you don't have a whole bunch of people writing, as you said, like one big CSS file to maintain. And they have all these different team members that are going in and doing different things in the CSS file. It's more like, okay, I'm making this component. I have these preset classes. I can use them, and it doesn't really affect anybody else. And I have a friend, Mike Apruccio, who always says like, the more people who are working on the CSS file, the worse things are. Like best case scenario is you have one person that sort of is in charge of the CSS, and then everybody can just use whatever they've created. So whether that's something like Tailwind with all utility classes, or maybe it's components that they're just working, like here's the component class, and nobody has to go in and touch that. They're just using it. I think like all of that sort of solves that same problem of when you have 8 people or 10 people or 20 people hacking away at CSS, that's when problems come up, and Tailwind really helps avoid that. So at scale for things like that, it's fantastic, and why I think people gravitate toward it. But I don't think it's this solution of like, oh, it's easier than CSS, because it's just a way of authoring CSS.
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's similar to how, if people jump straight to React or straight to Next.js without actually learning how JavaScript works first, or actually learning how like the web in general works first, they think that, oh, everybody's using React. React is easier. Well, I mean, it can allow you to build websites a little bit easier if you already know JavaScript. Like, I think it's a very similar thing to Tailwind. And like you said, the aspects that I've kind of liked about it is that it does kind of help you with that consistency of, you name your classes like this. You don't necessarily need to worry about, okay, I created this utility class in my CSS file, But then some other developer in a different CSS file also created the same exact class, but called it something else. And then you're just running into these issues. And I think that's one area to where it really helps. And it does kind of provide some out of the box structure that is a little bit helpful there. But kind of on a similar note, how do you kind of feel about other solutions to CSS, like CSS in JS and scoping your CSS right within your JavaScript? Have you used these tools? Are you kind of a fan of them? It sounds like maybe you prefer to go more of the just like basic CSS route. And I say basic, but like there's so much you can do with CSS. So it's really not that basic, but I think you kind of get what I mean there.
Yeah. So I am sort of, I've been using a lot of SvelteKit and Astro, which has like the scope CSS. You just throw your style tag on your component and you can go in there. And I sort of like the ease of that is so nice. So I have been using it. And I get why scope CSS has become really popular. And that idea of CSS and JS. The one issue I feel with it, it's sort of the benefit and the trade-off at the same time. Is you see projects where you get two people working on similar components, but they're different, but they're similar to one another, and they've both had to write their own CSS for it because you get this assigned on your sprint and the other person has their sprint going where they're assigned. They don't really know what the other person's doing, and you both wrote like 40, 50, 60 lines of CSS that are almost the same. And then when there's an update, well, you have these two different things that are living in isolation from one another. Part of that comes down to like project management and everything, and just like how that's happening as well. So like it's definitely a bigger scale thing, but it's the one thing I definitely see, and it's also like this where everything becomes scope CSS in whether it's like a CSS and JS or how some of these frameworks work. I think is a bad thing. Like people seem to want to fix the global scope of CSS, but the global scope of CSS, in my opinion, is a benefit. It's a really good thing. It lets us write a lot less CSS. And the less code you have, the easier things are to maintain, and everything is better, in my opinion. So like having some global styles, I'm not saying everything, but like having, just a lot of the defaults. Like I've seen projects where every single component has the font family declared, even though it's the same in everything on the entire site. And it's just because there was no global CSS file. It's just everything's living on its own. It's like, well, do I need to do that? Or could we just have like a body style that has the font family and a font size and a line height on it, and then we never have to worry about that? Or not never, but you know what I mean? Like having, get some global styles, because I guarantee you everything has a fair amount of global styles that can be used. And then for the more unique stuff, I get it. It's just, making sure, I think if you do get into that, you need good project management to make sure that you're not having very similar things across different files that then makes maintenance, like long-term maintenance, an issue. Which is the same a little bit with if you're using Tailwind or something as well, where if you're creating components and everything, this component has its classes that are all put on there, and then there's a similar one somewhere else, like updating those. If you did a margin 4 on something and like 3 different things need that changed, sometimes there's an easier way of doing it if it was a global. It really depends on the situation. And it is why CSS is tricky. It's just sort of like having to look at the big picture and the small picture at the same time. And you need someone within the project who's able to sort of see the big picture and also have a strong enough understanding, I think, of CSS to be able to wrap their mind around how everything needs to, or the best way that things could be organized, which is really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having some sort of balance there between some global CSS as well as, maybe some more scope CSS for when you have maybe a more unique situation definitely makes sense, as I feel like if you never use any global CSS, it's very easy to have just inconsistencies in your styles across your app to where it's like, okay, this card has a padding of 20 pixels, and then this card down here is a padding of like 5 pixels, and then everything just looks just a little bit off. Like it can be hard to notice, but like if you're a user using it, you might just feel like something's wrong with the design of this application here, which can kind of leave your users in like a state of like, this doesn't look professional or something like that. So I think having a balance of the two is definitely a good idea. And that kind of leads us into CSS modules, in which you can have kind of that scoping ability with using just kind of like generic CSS, but you can also, if you want to use like a global CSS file and just apply that everywhere and not kind of use that module syntax, you can kind of do the same thing. So how do you kind of feel about CSS modules, and do you regularly use that within your applications?
Yeah, so a little bit in that, as you said, I think it does strike that nice balance of being able to control things. I think it does fall into that same trap though, and it's a little bit like there's a talk at the last CSS day by Hayden Pickering where it's even talking about like this idea of scope styling, where it's like, you know, CSS sort of has scope styling to begin with. Like we've been trying, there's so many solutions now that try and introduce it, but you know, you can have a descendant selector. So if you have a card that has a heading in it, you just do like .card space H2, and then you've selected your heading inside the card. And I know people sort of start pushing away against that idea of having, you know, that was this thing that's hammered on at one point about like you shouldn't have descendant selectors and other things. And but like it works, and you are scoping it that way. So like I just think like I think what happens is whatever the tool is, and it doesn't matter which one it is, they all have pluses and minuses to them. There's strengths and weaknesses there, you know, that need to be, you know, if you do everything vanilla, you might be introducing more work. And I'm not saying that you should necessarily do that, but it's just, if you're going to use a tool, whichever one it is, that, you know, don't just use it because you used it on the last project. Maybe evaluate if that's, you know, what would be the best tool for any given project. Because sometimes just, you know, I've seen really simple things where you could just definitely don't worry about it and just, you know, throw it together quickly. And then other times where something else will do the trick. And I guess the big thing is like, then you get these Frankenstein projects that sort of mix a little bit. You know, I've seen CSS modules with Sass with Tailwind in the same thing. And I'm just like, I don't, you know, I don't know if it's too many people having input, if it's the evolution of the project over time where you have a different person who comes in who's like, oh, we should do it this way instead, but it's already built on top of something else. But like, yeah, sorry, I didn't really speak specifically to CSS modules there, but I think it applies to sort of, yeah, I think it's a good tool as long as it's used in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like similar to, you know, using a CSS framework and using different like, you know, styled components or CSS and JS. Yeah, there's use cases for it, and it's a tool that you can use, but you can also misuse it pretty easily. And just like vanilla CSS is also a tool that you could use and probably solve a lot of the issues that you're trying to solve with these other tools. And I think, like you said, often people will just use a tool because that's the tool they know, and they don't really look for other kind of solutions. And I think that can be applied to development in general across the board. Like, just because you know JavaScript doesn't mean JavaScript's the solution for this particular thing. So I think that that's really good advice there. And maybe as just kind of a final wrap-up question here, is there any kind of general recommendations that you have for someone using CSS, like any just general common mistakes to avoid, or any general advice to someone that maybe they're not super expertise in CSS, maybe they're a little bit like JavaScript first, kind of like I am, but they also are the front end team and they do a lot of CSS as well. Any kind of general advice there?
Yeah, I think I mentioned a bit earlier about like useless declarations on things that I see a lot. So it's like, don't, like if you're writing your CSS, you probably, you know, we probably have some sort of live server running and stuff. You can see your changes as you're making them. You know, don't declare something because you see it in, like, you have a Figma file open or whatever, and you see that font family is on there. Like, don't declare it unless you need that, because it probably isn't being inherited from somewhere else. Or don't put width 100% on something if you don't need it, because it probably already is width 100% or auto, which is even better than 100%. And like, there's a lot of defaults on things that people end up over, you know, deciding that like, oh, I see this thing in Figma, I'm gonna just code everything I see there. And it just leads to a ton of extra CSS that they don't need to bother having. Extra code, it's more maintenance. And if it's not needed, then you're sort of, you know, it just makes more trouble than anything else. And I think the other thing is that if it's not the world that you're coming, you know, if someone's more used to JavaScript or just any other language basically in general, is that understand that when you're going into CSS, that it does require a different mindset. It's not a world where you're working in absolutes. You know, you can't decide exactly what you want on the screen. There's a really good video that I always recommend to people to listen to by Miriam Susan on, if you just Google it or look on YouTube, it's called "Why is CSS So Weird?" And she does a really nice job of breaking down all the different things. But like the general thing is like, we don't know anything about really how the user is going to get the website. We don't know the viewport size, the resolution, the color gamut, the input device. You know, someone might be a keyboard user, a mouse user, a touch screen. They might be using a screen reader and they don't even see your page. Like there's so many different ways that someone's consuming the page. And like, if you're in the world of JavaScript, you're just saying like, if, you know, do this, if this is here, do that, if whatever it's, and like you're working in more absolutes. And obviously it gets a little bit trickier than that, but, or any other language though, generally is a little bit more, you know what the output is actually going to be. Whereas in CSS, it's more of like, these are general guidelines of what I'd like my page to look like. Let's sort of try and fit in with that a little bit. So I do think like that mindset shift is really important, to go into it with this idea that like, no, I don't have this static thing that's always going to look the same. Like it needs to be sort of more of a living, changing thing, and that's okay. And also the idea of like, just going back a little bit maybe, or like if you learn CSS and then you're sort of doing it a lot, like sometimes going back over the very fundamental parts of it can actually be really useful, just because it's easy to sort of get frustrated with it and think it's not working the way you want it to work because it's not doing what you want it to do. And a lot of people feel like it's counterintuitive a lot of the time in some of the behaviors that it has, but like if you learn it actually makes a lot of sense if you learn enough about it. There's a lot going on under the hood, and the browsers are super good at what they do, but you need to understand like how it's doing, or, you know, what are the fundamentals of it, and how is you don't have to learn how the rendering engine works, but just like, don't think that because I'm putting this on there that would be the right solution. Go like, how is I don't know. I'm stumbling a little bit right now on how I'm describing this, but it's, yeah, the idea that it actually does make sense. You just have to like figure out and get into that mindset of how it's actually working and working with it instead of fighting against it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you did a good job of explaining that. Like, I totally get what you mean. Like, I think a lot of people get frustrated with CSS when in reality, it's just like maybe a misunderstanding of how the browser is working, or maybe even how the default styles are being applied to an HTML element, and they're not really understanding that, okay, this element is actually just an inline element. It's not a block element, which is why you're seeing it squished up next to this other element, or different things like that. So I think with that, Kevin, this was a great discussion. I know I definitely learned a lot, be it just, you know, a regular JavaScript developer. This was super helpful for me, and I'm sure it was for the audience as well. So if people are like, hey, this guy knows his stuff, I would, make sure I followed him. Where can they go online to make sure they're staying up to date with what you're doing?
The best place is my YouTube channel, which is just, if you look up Kevin Powell or Kevin Powell CSS, worst case scenario, you'll find me. There are a few Kevins out there. There's also, if you want to just keep up to everything I'm up to, my newsletter, I guess, which is on my website. It's kevinpowell.co. And then there's a link to my newsletter in the navigation at the top. So I guess that's like that covers anything that I'm up to, whether it's my new videos, if I'm on podcasts, if I have an article come out somewhere, it's always in my newsletter. And I do I talk about random stuff that's on top of my mind as well. And if you just want to learn CSS related stuff, my YouTube channel is the place to be, I guess.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much.